William Shakespeare and his plays. An outline. William Shakespeare, often called England's national poet, is considered the greatest dramatist of all time. His works are loved throughout the world, but Shakespeare's personal life is shrouded in mystery. The pie name that has been given to Shakespeare is Bard of Avon or Swan of Avon. There are two primary sources that provide historians with an outline of his life. One of the sources says that his plays, poems, sonnets, and all the other official documents, such as church and court records, indicate that the following is the available information. However, these provide only a brief sketch of specific events in his life and yield very little insight into the man himself. When was Shakespeare born? No birth records exist, but an old church record indicates that William Shakespeare was baptized at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford upon Avon on April 26, 1564. From this, it is believed that he was born on or near April 23, 1564, and this is the date scholars acknowledge as Shakespeare's birthday. Located about 100 miles northeast of London during Shakespeare's time, Stratford upon Avon was a bustling market town along the river Avon and bisected by a country road. His childhood and education. Very little record is available about Shakespeare's childhood and virtually none regarding his education. Scholars have surmised that he most likely attended the King's New School in Stratford, which taught him reading, writing, and the classics. His wife and children. He married Anne Hathaway on November 28, 1582 in Worcester in Canterbury province. Hathaway was from Shottery, a small village a mile west of Stratford. Shakespeare was 18 and Anne was 26, and it turns out to be a kind of a marriage between a younger man and elderly woman. It is believed that the Anne Hathaway, the wife of Shakespeare, was already pregnant when he was married. The first child, a daughter they named Susanna, was born on May 26, 1583. 2 years later, on February 2, 1585, twins Hamnet and Judith were born. Hamnet later died of unknown causes at the age of 11. Shakespeare's last years, some of the years that were very dark as far as his records are concerned. There are 7 years of Shakespeare's life which no records exist after the birth of his twins in 1585. Scholars call this period the last years, and there is wide speculation on what he was doing during this particular period. The 7 last years refer to two important periods in Shakespeare's life about which we know very little. The first period lasted from 1578, the year that Shakespeare left grammar school, until November 1582, when he married Anne Hathaway. The second period of so-called 7 last years lasted from 1585 to 1592. Whatever it is, the last years refers to the period of Shakespeare's life between the baptism of his twins, Hamnet and Judith, in 1585 and his apparent arrival on the London theatre scene in 1592. We do not know when or why William Shakespeare left Stratford upon Avon for London, or what he was doing before becoming a professional actor and dramatist in the capital. There are various traditions and stories about the so-called lost years. There is no documentary evidence of his life during this period of time. One theory is that he might have gone into hiding for poaching game from the local landlord, Sir Thomas Lucy. Another possibility is that he might have been working as an assistant schoolmaster in Lancashire. It's generally believed he arrived in London in the mid to late 1580s and may have found work as a horse attendant at the school of at some time the London's finer theatres, a scenario updated centuries later by the countless aspiring actors and playwrights in Hollywood and Broadway. The King's Men. By the early 1590s, documents show Shakespeare was a managing partner in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company in London, with which he was connected for most of his career. Considered the most important troupe of his time, the company changed its name to King's Men following the crowning of King James I in 1603. From all accounts, King's Men Company was very popular. Records show that Shakespeare had works published and sold as popular literature. Although the theatre culture in 16th century England was not highly admired by people of high rank, some of the nobility were good patrons of the performing arts and friends of the actors. How his career in the theatre began is unclear, but from roughly 1594 onward, he was an important member of the Lord Chamberlain's company of players called the King's Men after the accession of James I in 1603. They had the best actor, Richard Burbager. They had the best theatre, the Globe, and they had the best dramatist, Shakespeare. That is why it was a clique. It is no wonder that the company prospered. Shakespeare became a full-time professional man of his own theatre, sharing in a cooperative enterprise and intimately concerned with the financial success of the plays he wrote. Actor and a playwright. By 1592, there is evidence that Shakespeare earned a living as an actor too and a playwright in London. Possibly he had several plays produced. The September 20, 1592 edition of Stationer's Register, a kind of a guild publication, includes an article by London playwright Robert Greene that takes a few jabs at Shakespeare. Greene wrote of Shakespeare in the following manner. There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, he is in his own conceit the only sex sheen in a country. Scholars, of course, differ on the interpretation of this criticism, but most agree that it was Green's way of saying Shakespeare was reaching above his rank. trying to match better known and educated playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, or Green himself. Early in his career, Shakespeare was able to attract the attention of Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, to whom he dedicated his first and second published poems, Venus and Adonis, written in 1593, and The Rape of Lucrece, 1594. By 1597, Shakespeare had already written and published 15 of his 37 plays. Civil records show that at this time he purchased the second largest house in Stratford, called New House, for his family. It was a 4-day ride by horse from Stratford to London, so it is believed that Shakespeare spent most of his time in the city writing and acting, and came home once a year during the 40th day Lenten period when the theatres were closed. Globe Theatre. By 1599, Shakespeare and his business partners built their own theatre on the south bank of the Thames River, which they called the Globe Theatre. In 1605, Shakespeare purchased leases of real estate near Stratford for £440, which doubled in value and earned him £60 a year. This made him an entrepreneur as well as an artist, and the scholars believe these investments gave him the time to write his plays uninterrupted. His death. Tradition holds that Shakespeare died on his 52nd birthday, April 23, 1616, but some scholars believe this is a myth. Church records show that he was interred at Trinity Church on April 25, 1616. The exact cause of Shakespeare's death is unknown, though many believe he died following a brief illness. In his will, he left a bulk of his possessions to his elder daughter Susanna, though entitled to a third of his estate. A little seems to have gone to his wife Anne, whom he bequeathed his second best bet. This has drawn speculation that she had fallen out of favor, or that the couple was not closer. However, there is very little evidence the two had a difficult marriage. Other scholars note that the term second best bed often refers to the bed belonging to the household's master and mistress, the marital bed, and the first best bed was reserved for guests. Did Shakespeare write his own plays? There is a doubt about the authorship. About 150 years after his death, questions arose about the authorship of Shakespeare's plays. Scholars and literary critics began to float names like Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, and Francis Bacon, men of more known backgrounds, literary accreditation, or inspiration, as the true authors of the plays. Much of this stemmed from the sketchy details of Shakespeare's life and the death of contemporary primary sources. Officials record from the Holy Trinity Church and the Stratford Grammar School record the existence of a Shakespeare, but none of these attest to him being an actor or a playwright. Skeptics also questioned how anyone of such modest education could have written with the kind of intellectual perspectiveness and poetic power that is displayed in Shakespeare's works. Over the centuries, several groups have emerged that question the authorship of Shakespeare's plays. The most serious and intense skepticism began in the 19th century when adoration for Shakespeare was at the highest. The detractors believed that the only hard evidence surrounding Shakespeare from Stratford upon Avon described a man from modest beginnings who married a young and became successful in real estate. Members of Shakespeare's Oxford Society, that was founded in the year 1957, put forth arguments that Shakespeare was the real author of the plays, and the aristocrats and the poets like Edward de Vere, the 17th century Earl of Oxford, was the true author of the poems and the plays of Shakespeare, and it is also another view expressed by the some of the members of the Oxford Society. The Oxfordians often cite de Vere's extensive knowledge of aristocratic society, his education, and the structural similarities between his poetry and that found in the works attributed to Shakespeare. They contend that Shakespeare had neither the education nor the literary training to write such eloquent prose and create such rich characters. However, the vast majority of Shakespearean scholars contend that Shakespeare wrote all his plays. They point out that other playwrights of the time also had sketchy histories and came from modest backgrounds. They again argue that Stratford's new grammar school curriculum of Latin and the classics could have provided a good foundation for literary writers. Supporters of Shakespeare's authorship argue that lack of evidence about Shakespeare's life doesn't mean his life did not exist. They point to evidence that displays his name on the title pages of published poems and plays. Tributes. The memory of Shakespeare survived long in theatrical circles, for his plays remained a major part of the repertory of the king's men until the closing of the theatres in 1642. The greatest of Shakespeare's great contemporaries in the theatre, Ben Jonson, had a good deal to say about him. To William Drumnott of Hawthornden in 1619, he said that Shakespeare wanted art. But when Johnson came to write his splendid poem prefixed to the folio edition of Shakespeare's plays in 1623, he rose to the occasion with the stirring words of praise. He said, "Triumph, my Britain, thou have one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time." Dating of Shakespeare's plays. Despite much scholarly argument, it is often impossible to fix the date of a given play precisely. But there is a general consensus, especially for plays written in 1588, in 1601, and 1605 to 07, and from 1609 onward. The dates of composition used here are based on the external and internal evidence, on general stylistic and thematic considerations, and the observation that an output of no more than two plays a year seems to have been established in those periods when dating is rather clearer than others. Shakespeare's two narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, can be dated with certainty to the years when the plague stopped dramatic performances in London in 1592-93 and 1593-94 respectively, just before their publication. But the sonnets offer many and varied problems. They cannot have been written at all at one time. The most scholars set them within the period of 1593 to 1600. The phoenix and the turtle can be dated between 1600 to 1601. Shakespeare's sources. Shakespeare wrote only two plays with original plots, namely Love's Labour's Lost and The Tempest. For all his other plays, he borrowed plots from other writers, from the histories, reordering events, inserting subplots, and adding or removing characters. The book he relied on most heavily for plot ideas was Holinshed's Chronicles. Published in 1577, the Chronicles is a collaborative work written by Raphael Holinshed and few others. The volume includes histories of England, Scotland, Ireland from the earliest time of inhabitation to the mid-16th century. The Chronicles served as Shakespeare's source for nearly all of his history plays. The plot of Macbeth also came from Chronicles, as did plot elements for King Lear and Cymbeline. Shakespeare's second most important source was a book by the Roman historian Plutarch titled Lives of the Notable Greeks and Romans. Shakespeare may have read the book in the original Latin, but he definitely read Thomas North's English language translation. We know this because Shakespeare clearly based Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and the Timon of Athens on North's translation. Indeed, sometimes Shakespeare followed North's wording so closely that a reader can figure out which page of lives he drew on for particular scenes. Aside from these major works, Shakespeare also borrowed from dozens of other writers. He borrowed many plots, ideas from Italian writers, especially from a medieval collection of stories called the Decameron by Boccaccio. He also borrowed from Roman writers, especially Ovid, Seneca, and Plautus, and from the great medieval English poets Chaucer and John Gower. He even updated stories and had been popular just a few decades earlier. For instance, The Winter's Tale, written around 1609, was based on a much loved narrative published in 1588 by Robert Greene, and Romeo and Juliet, written around 1595, is closely based on a long narrative poem by Arthur Brooke that was popular in 1560s. Shakespeare also occasionally drew inspiration from current events. Although the plot of The Tempest, written around 1610, has no precursor, Shakespeare based the catastrophic storm that opens the play on accounts of shipwreck that occurred in Bermuda in 1609. He also interwove thematic elements from works by contemporary Ben Jonson, the Roman poet Ovid, and the French essayist Montaigne. Finally, the importance of the Bible for Shakespeare's style and range of allusion is not to be underestimated. His works show a pervasive familiarity with the passages appointed to be read in church on each Sunday throughout the year, and a large number of allusions to passages to ecclesiastics, wisdoms of Jesus, the son of Sirach, indicates a personal interest in one of the Deuterocanonical books, namely the books from the Old Testament. What are the influences of Shakespeare? Shakespeare read widely and took inspiration from everything he read, but some writers proved especially influential, namely the writers who influenced Shakespeare. As much as Shakespeare was influenced by history and other writers, you know, he has also influenced other writers too. One important influence was Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe pioneered the use of blank verse, the form of Shakespeare uses in all his plays. Like Shakespeare, Marlowe also portrayed complex tragic characters on stage. He was only 2 months older than Shakespeare, but he was already the most famous playwright in England when Shakespeare began his career. The two men, namely Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, probably knew each other personally, but they could not have had a long friendship. Marlowe died young, killed in a tavern brawl in 1503 at the age of 23. Shakespeare paid tribute to Marlowe in several of his plays. As as you like it, addresses Marlowe directly and quotes one of his poems, Dead Shepherd, now I find thy saw of might. Whoever loved had not loved at first sight. This famous line is a kind of a tribute to Christopher Marlowe. This is the line much quoted from Shakespeare to quote love at first sight as a popular dictum. This particular concept is borrowed from Christopher Marlowe. The play also references the circumstances of Marlowe's death. When a man's verses cannot be understood, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room. This is again a reference that you find in As You Like It that is attributed to Christopher Marlowe. In these lines, reckoning refers to the bar bill Marlowe fought over, and the little room refers to the room, the tavern where Marlowe was killed. The French essayist Montaigne was another important influence on Shakespeare's plays. Montaigne's essays address a dazzling range of ideas, and Shakespeare's plays often explore similar ideas. In The Tempest, for instance, Gonzalo imagines the commonwealth he would create if he ruled the island where the place is set. His speech closely follows a passage from Montaigne's essay of the cannibals, but Shakespeare goes further than adapting the essay's language. He also adapts the essay's sympathy for so-called cannibals and savages, who Montaigne believed superior Europeans due to the natural innocence. So on. Shakespeare reflects this sympathy in his depiction of Caliban, whose critiques of the oppression he faces under Prospero are some of the most powerful and moving in the play. In addition to Of the Cannibals, Shakespeare also drew influence from the essay of the affection of fathers to their children, in which Montaigne argues that aging parents should not demand gratitude from their offspring. Shakespeare explores this topic in King Lear, in which terrible consequences befall a father who does precisely what Montaigne advises against. Shakespeare's sonnets show a wide range of influences. Shakespeare's sonnets, in particular, would not have been possible without the work of the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch. The sonnet was invented in the 13th century, but Petrarch perfected this form and took it further by stringing series of sonnets into thematic sequences that usually addressed to a love object. Petrarch's most famous sequence concerns his idealized love for a young woman named Laura. Beginning in the 16th century, many English writers used sonnet sequence to tell romantic stories. Though Shakespeare Shakespeare's use of sonnet form does not in itself indicate that he knew Petrarch's work. Romeo and Juliet provides evidence that he had indeed read Petrarch's sonnets. For instance, the language Romeo uses to idealize Juliet at the beginning of the play clearly satirizes Petrarch. In a less satirical mode, Shakespeare inserts a sonnet into a scene where Romeo and Juliet first meet. Their dialogue forms a shared sonnet, which each the lover provides one of the half of the rhyming poem. At the conclusion of the 14 lines, the lovers seal the sonnet with a kiss. Shakespeare also knew the work of other European poets inspired by Petrarch, including Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser, who were both favorites of Queen Elizabeth. Edmund Spenser wrote influential narrative poems such as The Shepherd's Calendar, The Faerie Queene. But by far the biggest influence on Shakespeare's own narrative poems is the epic Metamorphoses by the Roman poet Ovid. Metamorphoses was often studied at schools like the one Shakespeare probably attended in Stratford, and Shakespeare demonstrated a deep knowledge of Ovid in his earliest poems. Venus and Adonis is a retelling of an episode from Metamorphoses, and Shakespeare's poem imitates Ovid's playful and erotic style. Ovid also influenced Shakespeare's plays. In Midsummer's Night Dream, the play within a play performed by the Mechanicals is based on the story of the lovers Pyramus and Thisbe from Metamorphosis. Although the Mechanicals bungled the play enough to turn it into a comedy, the original story is tragic. The more faithful version of Pyramus and Thisbe appears in Romeo and Juliet, which also tells the story of two lovers who must keep their love secret from their parents and who die due to the misunderstanding.